Donald Trump's new trade tariffs will have serious implications for Australia, impacting key Aussie exports. Billions in value has been wiped from the Australian share market directly following the shock announcement from Donald Trump that he will impose sweeping 25% steel and aluminium tariffs on everybody, including Australia. As a result, the benchmark ASX 200 fell 0.5% at the opening bell for an estimated $15 billion loss in just the first hour of trading. The US imported about $638 million worth of Australian steel in 2024. Let's bring in Kyle Rodder from Capital.com. So about $650 million importing Australian steel. That's almost the amount of money that the Deputy Prime Minister, Richard Marles, handed over in a cheque to the US government last week for AUKUS. What's going on?
Yeah, well, we're still sort of trying to ascertain a few of the details here, because the announcement was more or less made while boarding Air Force One, and then subsequently there was some commentary on Air Force One as well about the nature of the tariffs. First of all, there was hopes that maybe this was just going to be an extension of existing tariffs. It would appear that these 20 and 25% tariffs are on top of the existing tariffs on aluminium and steel announced in the first Trump administration. And again, there's sort of some very vague details as to who this is targeting, why this is being done, and potentially whether it's something that is up for negotiation. Whether we do know that the Trump administration plans to talk with Chinese counterparts during this week about the existing 10% tariffs that were applied last week, as well as other trade concerns, or whether this is actually an attempt at economic management and trying to protect US steel, or even revive the US steel industry, amongst other metal producers as well. Nevertheless, it's clearly negative for markets because it potentially escalates the trade war even further. The Trump administration, and Trump himself, I should say, that if there are there's further retaliation, that the US will increase the tariffs once more. And again, it just shows at the moment that for market participants, the biggest concern at the moment is this kind of unfolding trade war and this tit-for-tat dynamic that's emerging.
Just last week, the Japanese Prime Minister was at the White House meeting with President Trump, and that US steel deal that Japan had wanted to buy into, that was knocked on the head not long ago by President Biden, seems to be back on the table. Could that be one of the reasons why Australia is going to be caught up in a 25% tariff?
I don't suspect so. It was quite interesting, actually, if we sort of move a few days past that. There was a conversation or some commentary on Friday about Trump potentially increasing tariffs on Japan on the basis that he wants to see a decrease in the trade deficit with the Japanese. And that was one of the reasons we actually saw Wall Street fall on Friday. That was sort of paired with some commentary as well about further tariffs announcements this week, one of which we've already gotten this morning, obviously. But also concerns that maybe tariffs would begin to be applied on some Eurozone economies. Again, the intent behind this isn't exactly clear yet. Obviously, there's the whole negotiating tool that Trump likes to exploit tariffs for. We don't know necessarily, other than obviously the Chinese. It creates a little bit of leverage with the Chinese, who he's trying to target here specifically, because it's across the board. I suspect a part of this is trying to revive the US steel industry and bring US manufacturing again onshore, which arguably from an economic standpoint, in fact, probably from an economic standpoint, is quite bad decision-making or poor judgment, just because it's a very, very difficult industry to revive when you talk about the US economy. But we're, again, lacking sort of some details here. It does seem to be more a part of this kind of, again, gaining leverage on adversaries just to begin with, as well as maybe a fairly significant attempt to try and change US industrial policy and protect US manufacturing.
All right, so in the first term of the Trump administration, Australia was able to secure an exemption, as you've mentioned. This time around, he's saying it's on everybody. Is this a punishment for Anthony Albanese and Kevin Rudd?
I don't suspect so either. I kind of reminds me, actually, of a quote from... I'll leave that to your next guest. I wouldn't want to steal it from him. But the point is, I don't think he thinks that much about Australia. We're a pretty small piece of the puzzle, and the value that we have to the United States is more or less our strategic position in the world and how that can help his ambitions in containing China, for the lack of a better term. This will be interesting, though, because what the Turnbull government, I believe at the time, from memory, it was Turnbull, did was able to get on the phone with President Trump specifically specifically and say, listen, we're an important partner of yours. We're on your side when it comes to some of these sort of containment policies when it relates to China. And not only that, you have a trade surplus with us. You really don't have to hit us with these. And we were able to kind of carve out a little bit of an exemption there. I think there are actually hopes that may be the case, because if you look at BlueScope steel shares today, they're actually higher, which in principle, if we did see tariffs applied on Australian steel, that would be a big hit to their profit margins. We'd see that stock drop. So I think there is actually some burgeoning hope that we'll be able to wriggle our way out of this. But really, the bigger impact is going to be how it influences the US-China relationship. We're obviously a bit of a pawn in that game. And on balance, that would be a negative thing for us, because obviously, this would have a pretty significant impact on iron ore demand.
The trouble is, as we can see from these pictures next to us at the moment, there's Richard Marles, the Deputy Prime Minister, who was in Washington meeting with Pete Hegseth, his counterpart, the Defence Minister over there, handing over a cheque of about $800 million for AUKUS. And straight after, when asked about the steel tariffs, the Deputy Prime Minister said, well, because of AUKUS, this will essentially protect us from having to pay tariffs. Now, just days later, tariffs slapped on everybody, including Australia. It's not a good look.
Yeah, no, not really. And again, I suspect just because we're such a small fry in the situation that it hasn't really factored into the thinking from the Trump administration yet. This is, again, an across-the-board tariff. It isn't specifically targeting us. And, the real focus will be on, effectively China and those other parts of the world that do have sort of thriving and, far more competitive steel industries in order to, again, gain some sort of leverage over them in future negotiations, or, again, simply trying to slow their economy down. It's just a part of that kind of strategic competition, as well as trying to probably in vain revitalise manufacturing. I think that's kind of the rationale. Again, the fact that we did see those kind of conversations emerging at a high level between the Trump administration and the Australian government says that, the dialogue is open, things are cordial. We might be able to carve ourselves out a concession here. Again, maybe price action today on the ASX actually reflects that. But this is about a bigger game between larger players, and we're really just getting kind of caught in the middle of it all.
How big, just remind us, is the United States as a trading partner for Australia? I know it isn't as big as China and Japan, for example, but you and I were speaking on Friday last week about the fact that because Australia has a trade deficit with the United States, it was quite likely that Trump would leave us alone, that Australia wouldn't be caught up in what's happened to Canada and Mexico and China. But here we are.
Yeah, and again, I think it is just because we're being caught up as collateral damage. I mean, he's not targeting this on us by any means. And again, there is that kind of dialogue that is open, and the I guess you could say the negotiating line with our government that, hey, leave us out of this. We're good mates. We're really not in any position at the moment of ripping you off, if you want to use sort of Trump's fairly irrational, I would say, from a purely economic point of view, language when it comes to trade. You've got, a surplus with us. We're not here to, obviously rock the cart at all. Carve us out this exemption, and we'll continue to do business as normal. I suspect that will probably be the case, but again, we're not really seeing. We don't have a firm rationale as to why these tariffs have been applied just yet from the Trump administration. And once we do, we'll get a better sense of how the Australian government can navigate that. For now, again, we're just being really kind of caught up in a bigger game here, where we're just such small players. We're not even really registering on the scale just yet.
Here's the thing though, just reading the comments from Air Force One, so speaking about the new tariffs during the gaggle of reporters on his way to the Super Bowl, he was asked about whether there would be any exemptions. He says there will be no exemptions this time. This is on every country. That surely means that Australia, there's no way out of this.
Maybe not. Again, I mean, it was very similar language to the first term of Trump. And again, I'm quite sure it was Malcolm Turnbull when it was his prime ministership. He was able to sort of negotiate that carve out. And, he tells the story very eloquently and has on numerous occasions about how he was able to sort of wriggle his way through. Again, I don't think we sort of, and this is just a personal opinion and my impression, I don't think President Trump thinks particularly much about us. And when he does say these sorts of things, he's typically quite absolute, quite general in nature. And again, he wants to be impactful. He's prone to hyperbole and generalisation. So again, I don't know if this is necessarily the death knell in the notion that we're going to all of a sudden be lumped in the sort of naughty corner as well with the United States other adversaries and trading partners that it doesn't like. It certainly could be the case, just because, again, we are so small that there really isn't that much of an interest in the Trump administration to carve out any kind of exemptions for us, although, again, we have that kind of strategic relationship which we might be able to leverage. It's too hard for me to say. I'm not too sure at the moment. But, the point is that if they go on and they are slapped on us, that will have a material economic impact. Although it has to be said, the bigger impact is actually because of iron ore demand coming from China. That's not going to be avoided whatsoever. So that should be said as well. But again, it's a wait and see. It's really impossible to tell with that kind of language. But we do have that kind of, negotiating tool there to be able to use to hopefully wriggle our way out of things.
I don't want to play the negative role here, but you talk about trade with China. We're obviously concerned about trade with China given the state of the Chinese economy and the flow-on effects that Australia might be caught up in. You use the term collateral damage if the US continues to impose more tariffs on China as well. Australia catches the cold in that case there as well. So now Australia is looking to the US, and this could have an impact on steel imports there, as well as the ramifications on what's happening on China. What's your outlook for the Australian economy?
Well, I mean, given this, it's fairly sluggish, and it's one of the reasons why, we might see a rate cut in a couple of weeks' time is because clearly the domestic economy is fairly weak. The export side of the economy is softer than it was a few years ago. So this is just another significant headwind to the markets. It's probably been well reflected in the Australian dollar, for example, which remains around 62 cents. This time last week, we hit a 5-year low on the, fears about the impacts of the tariffs on Mexico and Canada. So, really we're facing a fairly difficult set of circumstances. We're facing an economic environment that is rather weak. And again, if this continues to weaken China's economy, which is only really showing the most very, very nascent signs of life and green shoots in its recovery, then we're going to continue to be sort of weighed down by that and dragged down by that. So again, it's nothing new necessarily. The economy is weak. Everybody knows it. It's just that this adds to the potential malaise going forward and another significant headwind, which means any recovery is going to be harder to sustain going forward.
Now, we are lucky enough to be joined by Professor Tim Harcourt from UTS. Tim, keen to get your thoughts on this. I know you've been busy with media interviews as well. Talk to us your thoughts on, Donald Trump potentially slapping 25% tariffs on Australia.
Yeah, well, he said he was going to do it, and, I don't think it's... West and about 400 billion in aluminium, so it's a significant industry. Last time we got an exemption, it was 25 steel, 10 aluminium. He gave us an exemption. He allowed BlueScope to basically export to their factory in California and do it that way, helping with their industry. But this time, unless Kevin Rudd has some improved relationship with the administration, I think it's going to be very hard to get an exemption.
And that is something we've been talking about with Kyle. Kyle, obviously the hope for an exemption. Is Kevin Rudd, do you think, the correct person to be pushing for that at the moment, given his history with Donald Trump? We've known that Kevin has been kind of hanging out at golf courses, hoping to bump into the president in a hope to try and repair that relationship. Does Anthony Albanese have a big problem here going into the election?
I'm not too sure. I really not too privy to obviously the relationship they had. Obviously, it got off to a very rocky start. I'm not too sure if Trump still thinks Kevin Rudd is not the brightest bulb and still believes him to be nasty, and the other sort of invectives that were sent his way when asked about him. I think it was through GB News or whatever it was. The only thing that I'll say is, and I'll come at it from a financial markets perspective because that's sort of my area of focus, is that we are seeing BlueScope shares actually higher today, which for me was actually rather surprising because, again, as I said before, if you were to see tariffs being applied on Australian steel exports, they're our big player in town. For that would hurt their profitability. In principle, the stock should be lower. So maybe there's a little bit of hope, if nothing else, amongst investors that we will get something of a carve out once again. How the sort of dynamics between Rudd and Trump play out, I'm not too sure. I would imagine, though, at a very high level, the government would be wanting to get on the front foot about this, and again, trying to carve out an exemption for ourselves. Hopefully they can leverage that again. Again, there seems to be hope that that will be the case. But if it doesn't prove to be so, well, it'll just be a double whammy because, again, like we were talking about before, these tariffs will be bad for global growth generally. That's going to be bad for Australia in total. That direct hit to us will just make the matters even worse.
As I mentioned, President Trump made these announcements while he was on Air Force One heading to the Super Bowl. We can have a listen to part of that now.
Tomorrow?
Monday, yeah, tomorrow.
What countries will those go on?
Everybody, steel.
Including Canada and Mexico?
Yeah, any steel coming into the United States is going to have a 25% tariff.
What about aluminum, sir?
Aluminum too.
10%?
No, 25%.
25 for aluminum?
25 for both.
And on steel, sir, are you ruling out then Nippon Steel having a 51% stake or higher? They won't have a majority stake?
Nobody can have a majority stake for U.S. Steel. They can for other companies, but not for U.S. Steel. I think you agree with that, Doug, right? U.S. Steel was one of our great companies, and through a lot of stupidity and bad government and also bad management of the company, it lost that luster. But it's going to gain it back, and tariffs are going to help. Tariffs are going to make it very successful again. And I think it is good management now, too. Yeah.
All right, there he is, the President making that announcement on Air Force One. Professor Tim Harcourt, we've spoken about tariffs many times, the dangers of them, the fact that getting out of tariffs has been the story of the past 10, 20 years right around the world, that kind of open freedom. But when we look back a few weeks ago, really similar. It was a Monday morning that markets woke up to panic that there would be tariffs imposed on Mexico and on Canada and also 10% on China. A day later, things changed pretty quickly when he got on the phone with Justin Trudeau and also the President of Mexico. What could Australia offer aside from becoming the 51st state to get Trump off our back and to get that rollback on tariffs quite quickly?
Yeah, I think, Aaron, we said, to quote Joan Robinson, the British economist, tariffs is like putting rocks in your own harbour, and it could be potentially very bad for Pennsylvanian steelworkers and consumers in America. It's interesting. I remember we had that discussion on the program about Canada and Mexico, and it seemed that the tariffs were used as almost a political weapon. That is, I'll impose a tariff on Canada and Mexico, but if I get concessions on immigration and the drug trade, then we'll pause them. I can't think of anything that Australia has its equivalent because we don't have that land border. You remember even with Colombia, once they took the illegal immigrant who got into the United States back on the army planes to Colombia, then they did a deal as well. So we don't have that immigration and drug tension with the United States. So Trump's tactic of you put something on the table and take it off, we don't quite have something equivalent to what Canada, Colombia and Mexico had.
Kyle, we'll let you go in a moment, of course. You've been with us for a while, and I'll carry on speaking with Professor Tim Harcourt. But just finally, your thoughts on where things are at?
I can only say that this is going to be a continued process, at least again from a financial market perspective, which I sort of focus my time on, that this is going to be a prolonged trade war, and that this seems now that, more than just perhaps trying to, negotiate fairer terms with political partners and adversaries alike, that this is going to be a part of a tit-for-tat process now that might take months, if not years, to resolve. So I think that's probably something that has to be kind of discounted now and prepared for, and that's going to have all sorts of ramifications, whether it is for global economic activity, but also things like inflation, both domestically in the United States, but abroad and in places like Australia as well.
I just want to quickly get your thoughts as well, Kyle, just in regards to the RBA. You mentioned that briefly before. Obviously, all eyes are on the February meeting in the hope that there will be some good news, some relief. And I think if anyone's hoping for anything, it'll be Anthony Albanese after what has been a difficult weekend for Labor as well. From the political side, this is a nightmare scenario for Anthony Albanese, you would have to think. What do you think the RBA will be thinking today, or will they be waiting to see whether Trump reverses his plan and gives Australia an exemption?
The markets are pricing in that there will be a rate cut, and by the noteworthy lack of silence that we've heard from the RBA over the last couple of weeks as the data's come through, and the odds of a rate cut have increased, it would seem that they're preparing us more or less to lower interest rates. What I will say from a policy standpoint, and it was probably even better fleshed out from the US Federal Reserve a couple of weeks ago, is that it's incredibly difficult now in this backdrop to be able to anticipate what growth and inflation will do, because there is so much policy uncertainty. And that means that there's going to be, perhaps in this instance, a greater reluctance to moderate policy or ease policy on the basis that there will want to be evidence for what is actually going to happen, and then how it actually manifests in the data before policymakers, adjust policy accordingly. So, in a couple of weeks' time, it probably won't change things, because it's a very, very new development. It won't filter through the economy just yet. But when it comes to future policy changes, it may change that at the margins, and it will also probably increase a level of uncertainty from the rhetoric and commentary from the RBA going forward, because these things, again, are just too uncertain to be able to really make any kind of predictive judgments on.
Tim Harcourt, you were part of the BRAC's review into the car industry, and when I think about the BRAC's review into Australia's car industry, the number one recommendation that came out of it was to kill the tariffs, to open it up. Here we are 10, 15 years after Holden and Ford and Toyota ended production in Australia. What are your thoughts on tariffs now? Are we essentially, as a globe, going to be heading back? What do you think the European Union does? What do you think China does to the United States? Does this become tit for tat, as Kyle mentioned?
Yeah, well, that's a big danger of tariffs, is you do get these trade wars, and the mentality of people was to think that we're hurting someone else when you're actually hurting yourself. There is a view in Australia that tariffs hurt consumers, hurt workers, and hurt the export producing industries and potential export industries. And as we saw tariffs load in Australia, we were able to actually produce quite well for international markets. Even the car industry did very well globally as tariffs were removed. And the reasons for the BRAC's Commission's report were that regardless of tariffs, people were in the country for the design skills of autos, and in Victoria and South Australia. I think Australia is still going to probably maintain its position as a small, open economy. We'll probably do, I think, more in the industry policy space. We've seen that with the Albanese government's Future Made in Australia project, and I think either side of politics is probably going to invest in those types of things, but I don't think we'll see a return to high tariffs in Australia.
Kyle, your thoughts on that?
I don't think we're going to change the structure of our economy, more or less. I mean, there are arguments sometimes for some level of what you could call protectionism if you're trying to develop particular industries to compete eventually on a global stage, and making either necessary investments to kind of, again, pause free market principles in order to develop economic capacity to be able to compete on a global stage. I don't suspect it would be in our interest to take any of the, economic principles of Trumpism and apply them here, simply because we're so export driven. We rely so much on global trade. Our economy has flourished under the global trade system, and we would only be shooting ourselves in the foot. So I don't think this will change the longer run objectives of economic policy makers here. Maybe it'll make us a little bit more conscious of ensuring that some of the externalities and second order impacts of some macroeconomic policies, things like job losses, destruction of community, the alienation that comes from people losing a sort of connection to place that used to house very, very large and robust industries. And this is where you talk about the steel making story in the United States, for example. Maybe those things will be tempered a little bit, and we'll trade off a little bit of economic efficiency and growth to ensure that those parts of our community are protected. But on balance, I won't really deviate Australia's broader view on trade. In fact, we need to sort of be, at the moment, probably a promoter of free market principles, because certainly it serves our own domestic interests and ambitions in terms of economic growth going forward.
All right, Kyle, we'll let you go. Thank you so much for joining us, and we always appreciate your thoughts. Thank you, Kyle.
Thanks.
Tim, I'll remain with you because obviously you and I speak about these issues quite a lot and about where Australia fits in. How do you think the Prime Minister's office will be preparing to react to this now? What will they be doing? Will it be about trying to reassure Australians, reassure the market, given that the ASX dropped by $15 billion, 0.5% within the first hour opening trade on a Monday morning? Or will they be straight away on the phone to the backdoor channels at the White House saying, what the hell?
They've got to do both, I think. They've got to, reassure the Australian people that the Australian economy is in good shape. And as Kyle said, we're a small, open economy. We've done very well as an exporter in an open trade economy. And as Kyle was saying about differently affected communities, I went from the AU to trade, and I had a look at exporters as employers, and they paid 60% better wages, union jobs, better health and safety, and so on. So I think there's a good positive case you can make for Australia as a trading nation. I think, though, they will be going through the back channels and seeing what they can do. I mean, regardless of who is president or who is Prime Minister, there's a lot of institutional exchanges between Australia and the United States at the official. So I imagine that they can there. And I think, Aaron, this future made in Australia sort of push has been part of this. I think it's they don't want to go back to high tariffs, but I do think that there is a view that there should be activist, government involvement in trade industry policy. And I think that's what that future made in Australia push is all about. And I think after COVID, I think that centres close, schools and vaccinacy, and you do have to build up your local capability, as well as having a diverse number of trading partners that can help you with supply. So I think we learned a few lessons from that COVID period, and perhaps industry policy is not such a dirty word in policy circles as it was in the 80s and 90s.
All right, we'll leave it there for now. Professor Tim Harcourt, really appreciate you jumping up and giving us your insights here on Ticker. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron.